For most fans of gaming's past, the name Surtech conjures up thoughts of the Wizardry series, with its dungeon exploration and brutal challenge. Dungeon-crawling role-playing games weren't all they were known for though, and Star Maze was their first game to stray away from dungeons when released for the Apple II in 1982. The story begins in the year 2891, where an alien artifact was discovered by explorers. Within this Star Maze were a plethora of riches in the guise of power jewels, pure energy in crystalline form. But, as is always the case with discoveries like that, the Star Maze is well guarded by vicious alien craft, dedicated to obliterating anyone who would try to take possession of the jewels within. Those in charge eventually thought of a scheme to find someone to tackle it. Travel back to the 1980s and publish a video game challenging players to tackle a recreation of the Star Maze. Which is where you come in. At least had you been there in the 1980s, of course. Who knows if they're still monitoring your score results almost 40 years later. Right? The Star Maze is made up of 16 levels, and your goal for each is simply to find the 9 power jewels and deliver them to the mothership in order to move to the next. The maze is represented in a mostly abstract manner, as you'll wrap about when reaching its edges, and instead of a plethora of walls blocking your progress, you'll find rectangular regions providing structure to the chaos within. Colliding into these walls results in you simply bouncing off, instead of exploding into a million pieces, which is incredibly handy when starting out, as the controls might not click right away. Especially as they offer the first point of distinction between this original Apple II version and conversions released the following year to the Atari 8-bits and Commodore 64. On the Apple II side of the fence, you've got options for using keys, paddles, or an analog joystick. If you happen to have a particular Joy card installed, you've also got support for Atari-compatible joysticks along with that. In playing this version, I primarily played using an analog stick, in which you move the stick to turn your craft to a given direction, and apply thrust using the first fire button. Unsurprisingly, firing your ship's cannons is done by pressing the second fire button. Now, this analog joystick support allows you to rotate your ship in far more directions than offered by the Atari and Commodore 64 versions, which are both limited to 8 as a result of their digital joystick support. To help on those versions, you've got 2 control modes on offer. The default is similar to that of the Apple version, in which pushing the joystick rotates your ship to point in a given direction, and once locked in, applies thrust to increase its speed. The second makes things play out more like Asteroids, where left and right rotate your ship, and up applies thrust. Now, it's worth getting used to this one and trying it out, because it offers one big advantage: being able to shoot and rotate at the same time. Now, that's a minor thing, but it really becomes advantageous for dealing with the aliens as you explore the maze, of which there just happens to be quite a variety of them about. Most obvious are the asteroids, which can be blasted into smaller and more hazardous fragments, earning you more points the more damage you do. There are a variety of enemy ships, ranging from small ones like the cruisers or scouts to the UFOs and gigantic space stations. There is a good selection of them on offer, each having their own specific pattern in how they'll attack, along with differing degrees of lethality. The only letdown is that they're all kind of present from the outset. Yeah, it's a minor letdown, but one thing I love about arcade games is watching them introduce new threats as you move further and further into the game. It really mixes up the challenges involved in learning how to take them all down, as new enemies usually mean you have to rethink your strategies and plans for attack. Then again, considering these levels aren't really all that short to deal with in finding all the jewels, it's perhaps introducing them all up front is a better deal. At least that way, you'll get a chance to see all of them that you'll have to face. When things get incredibly frantic and hairy, you do have a couple of extra tricks up your sleeve in order to get out of trouble. Making a hyperspace jump lets you warp to a random place on the level, with the chance you might crash into something as you appear. You've also got antimatter bombs, which can obliterate anything on screen. These are in limited supply, but providing you clear out stages quickly, you can earn extra ones as a bonus. But onto the jewels themselves. These are randomly placed within the stage for each run, so whilst the stages themselves can be learned, you can't rely on the jewels and your mothership being located in the same position for each time you play. Locating them all is part of the challenge, especially as you have no navigational aids available to help. Thus, developing a systematic way to cover the maze is important for recovering those jewels as quickly as possible and thus earning more bonus points in the process. Now, collecting the jewels isn't just about flying over them, but doing it slowly. And that brings another difference between the versions. In the original Apple II version, your speed is represented numerically, so keep it under 200 units and you're all set for pickup. On the Atari and Commodore versions, however, your speed is shown as a bar with 2 segments, so providing your speed is within the first smaller segment, you're all clear. Thankfully, your craft can carry more than 1 jewel at a time, so if you locate multiple jewels during a trip, you're free to grab them and return them in one fell swoop. Dropping them off is similar to picking them up. Approach the mothership and slow down as you fly over to deposit them, earning increasing points for each you do. Flying over the mothership at this speed will also refuel you on the Atari and Commodore versions, whilst for Apple players, you've got to reduce your speed even further to under 100 units to be refueled as well. If you've scored enough points, when the game ends, you've got a high score table to enter your initials on, which, unlike many of its peers, allows you to save them to disk, which is totally a great way to keep a record of your prowess without needing to find one's high scores notebook. For such an early release though, the presentation is fairly minimal. Between games you do have an attract sequence which runs whilst you see the game's credits on the side panel. When in game, this panel shows your score, lives, bombs count, the remaining jewels to collect, and readouts for your speed and remaining fuel. Between the 3 versions, it's only the speed gauge which differs between the Apple and Atari Commodore 64 versions. It's something I'd give to those later ones, if only because there's less mental processing to do when working out if you're at a slow enough speed for picking up or dropping off jewels. Other than that, all the appropriate details are displayed and quite easy to read on screen. Unsurprisingly, on a visual front, you're not looking at incredibly detailed or colourful graphics here. The sprites are simplistic, though between your ship, the various enemies, and the jewels, they all have unique silhouettes on screen to easily distinguish them as you battle your way through. As you'd expect, colours aren't all that heavily used on the Apple version, though the walls do rely on Wizardry to get even more colours out of the system. Something specifically called out on the back of the packaging with its 18 colour graphics, not just the basic 6 tagline. It's a trick I'd love to see on a real display, as modern monitors and upscalers and line processors just don't replicate that style of blending, resulting in the patterns you see here instead of those fancy colours. So what about the other versions? Well, a similar general aesthetic applies, though the Atari version does take advantage of the extra palette available for those wall colours, though it's still dithering relying on that blending to get some more tricks out of the system. Oh, to be back in 1983 with an appropriate monitor to enjoy these games on. But alas. The biggest variety between the 3 systems is in the audio department. Now, the game might not offer anything more than spot effects, but they do work well enough on the Apple with its simple sound hardware. Basically a beeper. Things do get exciting on the Atari with its Pokey chip, which brings that arcade-style crunch to the effects. And it works incredibly well here as a result. It really brings that arcade atmosphere home, which is something many games for the Atari did during this era. But for the C64, the effects are a little less detailed here, as whilst the SID is a great sound chip and can do some great effects, you really need more work to put into it to make that happen. Considering how early a release this game is, it's no real surprise to see that coders were still learning how to put it to use, so the results are understandable. Star Maze originally came out when games for home micros were split between pure arcade conversions, or clones thereof, and those which tried to take those mechanics and build upon them. This is absolutely one of the latter games, succeeding in bringing movement mechanics from arcades of the time and bolting them onto a slower paced game more suited for play at home. From goals beyond simply blasting everything which moves, to collecting the jewels whilst managing your fuel supply and being attacked by a varied cast of aliens, there is more on offer than you might think. Of the 3 versions released, the weakest for me personally is the Commodore 64 one. Its biggest weakness is its sluggishness. It might not be much watching this video, but for a frantic game like this, the pacing is what matters, and the Commodore 64 just isn't up there with the other 2. It really just doesn't carry that sensation all that well. But for the other 2, I'm actually kind of split between whether I prefer the Atari or Apple version. While controls on the Atari version are limited to 8-way movement, as with the C64 version, the overall speed is faster, making the challenge of battling your way through the maze far more appealing. The overall vibe is greatly helped by those pokey sound effects, making for another game where the atmosphere of the arcade is brought home, making it far more engaging as a result. Though not as smooth as its Atari counterpart and featuring less detailed sound, the Apple II version wins out on controls for me. You might feel in a game like this that digital controls would be better, but honestly, the extra rotation angles offered by its analog inputs make taking on the alien forces that bit easier thanks to the extra finesse they offer. Will Star Maze be the type of game which keeps you going for months on end? Probably not, to be honest, but as a frantic, quick fix kind of game, it does more than enough to make it worth spending some quality time with, ranking up some high scores in the process. Especially if you're an Atari 8-bit or Apple II fan looking for an action game which offers something quite different from its peers available at the time. And with that, it's time to sign off. But before I do, I just want to say thanks as always for taking another voyage beyond the Scanlines.